Here's a really great feature of CSS. It's being able to make gradients with code. Gradients are typically one color that fades into another, but CSS allows you to control every aspect of how that happens. We can control things like the direction, the shape, the colors, how they transition from one another. We have so much we can do with gradients. CSS gradients generally display a smooth transition using two or more specified colors. They provide better control and performance over using an actual image of a gradient file. The background image CSS property is used to declare gradients as a background. We have three types of gradients in CSS: linear, radial, and conic. The linear gradient CSS function creates an image consisting of a progressive transition between two or more colors along a straight line. These are perhaps the most common type of gradient we see on the web. They're called linear because the colors flow from left to right, top to bottom, or at any angle you choose in a single direction. Let's see what linear gradients look like in practice. Here's the web page that I've created for us to work with. This pretty much consists of divs, each with unique classes, and they have h2s inside of them. If we look at the starting CSS, you can see that I have some basic styles on the h2. In order to vertically and horizontally center it within the div, I'm using a line height that matches the height of the elements. This causes the text to be vertically centered within this particular element. I'm also using a text shadow, which we looked at earlier, and a text line center on the h2. For the divs, I'm using a border radius of 50%, which is turning them into circles. I have a border, a width and height, and some margin. Let's get into the gradients. We'll start off and create some linear gradients. What I'm going to do is I'm going to target example 1, and then we'll use the background property to apply a gradient. When we want to specify a linear gradient, we'll go ahead and write linear gradient, and then we're going to open parentheses, and inside the parentheses we pass in the values that we want to display on our gradient. You're going to specify your color values using any of the color methods that we've discussed in previous exercises, and you do need to separate the colors by commas. If I save and we refresh, you can see that I have a linear gradient. By default, we never specified any sort of angle, so the gradient is going to display from top to bottom. The starting color is the first color that you've specified, and the ending color is the second color that you've specified. Let's make another linear gradient, but this time let's have it change directions. We'll have this gradient go from left to right. To make the gradient go from left to right, we pass in the additional parameter right at the beginning of the linear gradient function. We'll use the words to right, to left, to bottom, or to top. Once we've specified the direction parameter, we'll use a comma, and then we'll go ahead and plug in our color values. When we save and refresh, you can see that now the gradient is starting from the left and going to the right. The first color that we've implemented starts on the left, the second color will display on the right. In addition to changing the direction, we can also control how the colors are going to appear. By default, they'll just equally span within the space, but if we want to control that, we can pass in a % value after each of the colors. So if I change the first color to 30%, and then the second color, we'll go ahead and we'll specify 80%. When we save and refresh, notice the change. What's happening now is the blue color starts at 30% of the overall width of the element. So the blue part of the gradient starts right about here. Then the transition occurs, and then the green color, its transition is going to end at 80%, so right about here. So we can actually control how wide we want the gradient to be. If I change this to 60% for the first value, you're going to see how the gradient occurs in a much more narrow area of my element. Now it doesn't start till 60% and it pretty much ends at 80%. So this can be used to control where the gradient sits within the element as well. For our third example, we're going to use 3 colors, and we're also going to use another keyword to control how the gradient sits within the parent element. This time I'm just going to use background instead of background image. It is possible to use the shorthand method of declaring the gradient. Technically, it is part of the background image, but we can certainly use shorthand to declare the rule as well. The first value I'm going to pass in is going to be 0.25 turn. Then I'll pass in the colors. If we save and refresh, you can see what's happening to the gradient. It's making a gradient that is spanning 3 colors now: the pink, the pale yellow, and then the teal color. The quarter turn keyword is controlling the direction of the gradient. So if this has been set to 0, the gradient is going to go from the bottom to the top. If we make this a 0.5 turn, it's going to flip and go from the top to the bottom. A quarter turn is like rotating the gradient 90 degrees, or a quarter of a way around the circle. So you can almost think of this like a clock, where as we increase these values, it's going to rotate how the gradient sits within the parent element. The radial gradient differs from a linear gradient in that it starts at a single point and emanates outward. The radial gradient CSS function creates an image consisting of a progressive transition between 2 or more colors, and it radiates out from an origin point. Its shape may be a circle or an ellipse. Let's see how we can create radial gradients. The way in which we implement the radial gradients is very similar. We simply are going to use background or background image, and then we'll specify radial-gradient, open our parentheses, and then we can plug in the values. So I'm going to start off by just passing in 2 colors. If we save now and we refresh, you can see the difference. Now we have a gradient that is radiating out from the center of the parent element. Let's create another radial gradient. For this gradient, I'm going to go ahead and pass in 3 color values. If we save, as you would expect, we're going to get 3 values. Now, I'm going to actually change my image to being more of a square so I can show you this next value that I want to use on my radial gradient. Because I have a border radius of 50%, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the border radius, and we'll just make it 10 pixels, and then we're also going to pass in a width of 400 pixels. This will make this particular shape be more of a rectangle. So if I save and we look in the browser, you can see how the radial gradient is appearing within this rectangular type of shape. As you can see, the gradient is spreading out in the available real estate that is there. It is now taking up an elliptical type of shape, and this is the default behavior of radial gradients. We can force this to appear in more of a circular type shape by using the keyword of circle. If I refresh now, you can see how now the gradient is going to change to be a circular type of gradient instead of an elliptical type of a gradient. In addition to passing in circle, I'm also going to add, after the word circle, closest side. If we save now and we refresh, you can see how the gradient gets much smaller. What closest side does is it forces the gradient to take into consideration the smallest dimension, and it will match that as the closest to the shape's center. So now my gradient is isolated around the height instead of taking into consideration both the width and the height, and that is forcing this radial gradient to be smaller. We also have other options such as farthest side, closest corner, and farthest corner. If I change this to closest corner and we save and refresh, you're going to see that it looks much like it does as the default. The closest corner, the gradient is going to end at the corner that matches as the closest of that shape's center, which, because our image is rectangular, it's going to force it to be as it appears by default. I'm just going to change this back to closest side, and I'll save and refresh. Let's move on to the next element, example 6. Once again, I'm going to use Radial Gradient, and now what we're going to pass in is we're going to say circle, and then we're going to use at 100%, and then I'll pass in a color value. I'm going to put a comma, then we'll put our next color value, followed by 50%, and then I'm going to put a comma, and we'll use one more color, and we're going to add 75%. If we save and we refresh, you can see for example 6, my radial gradient has been offset. It is no longer appearing at the center. What this is specifying is it's forcing the center of the gradient, if you will, to start at 100% width of the containing element. Then we're telling the yellow color to be at 50%, and finally the teal color to be at 75%. The teal color will simply fill in any additional space that is available. This is really cool because you can offset your gradients and have them appear in all sorts of creative ways. The third gradient type is the conic gradient. A conic gradient is similar to a radial gradient. Both are circular and use the center of the element as the source point for the color stops. However, where the color stops of a radial gradient emerge from the center of the circle, a conic gradient places them around the circle. They're called conic because they tend to look like the shape of a cone that is being viewed from above. There's a distinct angle provided, and the contrast between the color values is great enough to see the difference. Let's create some conic gradients, and just to stay organized, let me put a comment in between my radial and linear gradients. Okay, for the conic gradient, I'm going to target example 7 to start off with. We'll use background, and we're going to say conic gradient, and we'll open and close the parentheses. I'm going to start off by saying from 40 degrees, then I'll use a comma and I'll pass in my colors. Let's save. And if we refresh in the browser, you can see in the browser that it creates the conic gradient. The 40 degrees is controlling where the gradient starts and where it ends. Let's make a conic gradient that is a little bit more complex, for example 8. We'll start off by writing from 0 degrees. Then I'm going to say at 0%, 55%, comma. This is going to tell the conic gradient to start at 0 degrees, and then it's going to span between 0 and 55%. Next, I'll pass in some colors. After I have the last color, I'm going to write 180 degrees. If we save now and we refresh in the browser, you can see how my conic gradient is appearing. If we look in the developer tools, it might be easiest for you to visualize what's happening when I start to make changes to this element. So I'm going to target example 8, and if we come in and start to augment some of these values, so instead of 0 degrees, if I start to move this, you can see how the angle changes. So this would be 90 degrees. So I'll set that back to 0 degrees. Now, if we adjust the 0 and 55%, you can see how it's controlling where the gradient is sitting vertically within my shape. So 55% is moving it so it starts roughly about halfway down on the circular shape. The first value, the 0, if we start to move that, you can see how this is controlling where it sits horizontally in the shape. So I want it to be at 0, so it's emanating out from this left-hand edge. This doesn't necessarily look like a standard conic gradient, but you can get really creative by adjusting these degrees and percentages along with the colors. You really have endless options. Let's look at a few more. What we're going to do for example 9 is we're going to create a pie chart. We're going to do this exclusively by using code and using our conic gradient. The first value that I'm going to pass in the parentheses is going to be the first color. Then I'm going to specify 36 degrees. I want this image to start at 0 and go to 36 degrees. Next, I'll pass in my next color value, and then I'm going to tell it that I want it to go from 36 degrees to 170 degrees. I'll use a comma again, we'll pass in the final color value, and we're going to tell this one we want it to start at 170 degrees. This will leave us no room to create any sort of blend. So when we save and refresh, you can see that I get more of a pie chart. So the first color, the teal, is going from 0 to 36 degrees. The second color is starting at 36 degrees and going to 170. The final color is going from 170 and just filling in the rest of the shape. And this is how we are able to create a pie chart. I have one more conic example to share with you, and this one is going to create something that will probably look somewhat familiar to you. Within the parentheses, I'm simply going to pass through keywords of red, yellow, lime, aqua, blue, magenta, and red. If we save and refresh, you can see that I get a color wheel. So this one is just letting the colors take up whatever available space they can, and it's blending them around the color wheel. For these last three examples, we're going to use some of our gradients, but we're going to use them in creative ways so that we can create some unique types of gradients. So let me just add a comment, and we'll just call this special effect gradients. I'm going to start off by targeting example 11. We'll add our background property. And for this one, we are going to use a linear gradient, but we're going to tell it to repeat. So we do have a repeating linear gradient. Repeating gradients allow us to take a trick that we can already do with the creative use of our color stops in the linear and radial gradients. It allows us to create patterns out of gradients and repeat them indefinitely. I'm going to open the parentheses and we'll pass in 45 degrees. Then we're going to go ahead and pass in some colors. I'm going to put the first color, I'm going to add a comma, and then I'll add the exact same color again, followed by 10 pixels. This is going to define the width of how far I want this color to appear from. Then we'll just do the same thing, but we're going to augment the color. So I'm going to add the next color that I want to appear, followed by 10 pixels. Then I'm going to put a comma, and I'm going to use that same color again, followed by 20 pixels. If we save and refresh, you can see what I get. I get stripes that are appearing. So in this way, we are just repeating this pattern over and over again. It's filling the shape with the blue, and it's telling it to go till 10 pixels. Then starting at 10 pixels, it's filling with teal, and it's going to 20 pixels. And we have just augmented the angle of the gradient. So instead of going from top to bottom, it's going at a 45-degree angle. Let me show you what this looks like with a radial gradient. This time we'll use repeating radial gradient, and we're going to plug in similar types of values, except instead of starting at 45 degrees, I'm going to say circle to force my gradient to be a circle instead of ellipse, which probably won't matter since it's in a circle anyways. Then I'm going to put at 0, 0. We'll use a comma, and let's pass in our first color. I'm going to follow this by a comma. I'll use the same color again, and once again I'm just going to use 10 pixels. Now we'll use a comma. We'll pass in our next color. We want this one to start at 10 pixels, and then I'll use a comma. I'm going to use that same color again, and we're going to tell it to go to 20 pixels. And because we're using the repeat radial gradient, it will simply repeat this. If we save and we refresh in the browser, you can see how I get a repeating radial gradient this time. I've offset the center of the radial gradient by using 0, 0. If we didn't have the 0, 0, then the gradient would just emanate out from the center of the shape. And the final example, we're going to get real creative with our gradients, and this time we're going to actually create a checkerboard using linear gradients. So to start off with, I'm going to set the background color to white. Then we'll use our background image, and we're going to specify a linear gradient. I'm going to pass in 45 degrees, use a comma, then I'm going to pass in the color that I want to use, and we're going to pass in 25%. I'll add a comma, then I'm going to specify transparent 25%, and transparent 75%. And finally, the same color again. We're going to tell it to begin at 75%, and then we'll just end with our same blue color. Now, if I save and we refresh, you're going to see that we get something that looks like this. We're going to actually repeat and add an additional gradient. So you remember when we used background image, we can use more than one image. So here we're going to do the same type of thing. I'm going to simply copy my gradient, and I'll pass in a comma, and let's put this on the next line. I'll do a linear gradient again, but we're going to augment some of these values. So this time I'm going to use negative 45 degrees. We're going to use the same blue color at 25%, transparent at 25%, transparent at 75%, and then the color at 75% and the same value. If we save now, you're going to see that it looks like it's kind of framed in the circle. So in order to make this checkerboard appear, we're going to add our background size property, and we're going to scale this down. So let's scale it down to maybe 50 by 50 pixels. And if we save now, you'll see that I get a checkerboard. As you can see, there are a ton of creative ways in which you can implement gradients. It's not just a straightforward gradient like you may have imagined. You can use this property in all sorts of special ways to create unique colors and artwork within your web pages.